All right, good evening. So this evening we're going to work on our opening to the prophecy in the book of Daniel. And tonight, as crazy as it sounds, we may actually not get that much into the book of Daniel. Because one of the problems that we have with prophecy is we don't put it in the proper context. And if you got the email notes from me, you'll see that we're going to go through a lot of places in the Bible. You don't necessarily have to have fast fingers and flip through to get there. If you can, that's fine. If you have it on a tablet or a phone, that's good. But just what I want to do, the whole purpose of this is we're going to try to put everything in context, because context is very important in anything that you do in the scripture, any kind of study that you do in the scripture. I don't know how many times I've heard, in Chronicles where there's I think it's chapter 14 where it says, if my people are called by my name will humble themselves and turn their faces towards me, I will heal their land. And I've heard it used applying towards America. And while it's a good principle, it wasn't applied towards America. It was applied towards the nation of Israel, whose name means a prince in front of God. So they bear the name of God. So when we look at all of these prophecies in Daniel, there's one thing I want you to keep in mind. And one of those things is that it's a Jewish man asking his God about what's going to happen to his Jewish nation. Now, luckily for us, the good part is that we're all blessed because of what comes out of the Jewish nation. After all, the Old Testament, the Jewish Bible, has the same overarching story as the New Testament, the Christian Bible. And that is, when we join them all together, they all tell the story of the coming of redemption of Jesus Christ to all of mankind. Now, he used the Jewish people as the vehicle for that. And so that's why we need to keep it in this context, just so and further we get along, it's going to get deeper. Some of the stuff you're going to notice is that it's going to be oriented more around the things that are happening in Israel and Judea as a geographical area as well. So let's start. If you look in your notes, let's look here at the introduction to Daniel, part 1, and we're going to go way, way back into Genesis. We're going to start in Genesis 2:2, and in Genesis chapter 2, verse 2, you're going to see that God creates the Sabbath on the seventh day. And if you have the notes, you'll see that the Bible verses are in the yellow highlight and the dates are in green. Now, I did day 7 because we don't exactly know how many years to a day that is, but so day 7 is the best date that God gave us. On day 7, God creates the Sabbath. And in Genesis 12, the next big thing we need to remember is that God calls Abraham. And that's about 2100 BC. Keep in mind now that I don't think it's too bad, because I have to remind myself this, is that the dates, the older it gets, the bigger the number gets. And the closer to us, the numbers shrink. So 1 BC is the year right before 1 AD. All right? So in 2100 BC, God calls Abraham out of his nation. He lived up in Mesopotamia, and God called him out and said, come to this land that I will give to you. So in Genesis 15, God makes a covenant with Abraham. Now, Abraham's people, his sons, multiply, and they end up through a series of events in Egypt, where they become slaves to Pharaoh for 400 years. In the book of Exodus, we hear Israel leaves slavery in Egypt in the year 1446 BC. Now, keep in mind, all these dates are pretty relative. You may have another commentator that gives you a different number, but they're all probably going to be pretty close to this. In Exodus chapter 20, we get the 10 commandments. And commandment number 3 is that you're going to keep the Sabbath. So I want you to notice a pattern here. God has in mind, he has a people, he has them in mind, and he has the Sabbath in mind as well. And that's all going to fall in here. So Exodus chapter 20, the 3rd commandment that God gives Moses on Mount Sinai on the stone tablets, which he then breaks because he gets mad and gets another set, is number 3, observe the Sabbath. In Exodus 35, God tells Moses one of the I guess you would say, the elaborations on the law that God gives Moses talks about execution for breaking the Sabbath. Does anybody get the picture here that God takes this Sabbath thing pretty seriously? Now, we're not under the law, but God takes this whole Sabbath thing pretty seriously. So in Leviticus chapter 25, we start to see another level of Sabbath develop. And that's because the people are not yet in their land, but he is preparing them in the book of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy for a kingdom that is modeled after him, that is a theocracy. In other words, God will rule it, and they will rule under his laws. So, whoops, let's see, I got something popping up on my screen. So then, let's see, where was I again? Oh yeah, Exodus chapter 20, Exodus 35, we see the execution for breaking the Sabbath laws. Leviticus 25, this is a law book. This is kind of like going into a lawyer's office and picking up a book of law. In their law, it gives laws for the Sabbath and the Jubilee years. And basically what that says is we as people, God gives us a gift because he rested on the seventh day. He gives us a day of rest. And that is to sit back and contemplate his goodness and his greatness. And it's a gift from God towards men. Jesus will say, God didn't make man for the Sabbath. God made the Sabbath for man. But you see this next level develop. And that next level is going to be a Sabbath for the land and for debts. It's a greater Sabbath. So every 7 years, you will get a Sabbath year. And every 7 years, you let the land rest. God says he will give enough on the 6th year. He'll give enough so that you will have food to eat on the 7th, 8th, and 9th and plant your crops. Because if you plant on the 7th, if you don't plant on the 7th, then you plant on the 8th, eating off of what you made on the 6th, and then on the 9th, you get to harvest again. So that's what he says, that the 6th year, if you listen to him, the 6th year, he'll give great bounty, and you can give the land a rest for 7 years. And later, we would see that become a thing, crop rotation will become an agricultural principle. You'll find out lots of things in the Levitical law, even though we're not tied to the ceremonial part of the law, like certain amount of fringes on us. There are certain things like cleanliness and staying away from people that are sick that we're all experiencing right now that you'll see as a benefit in God's law. So every 7th year is a Sabbath year for the earth itself, for the land of Israel, for the nation. And then after 7 Sabbath years, which would be after 49 years are complete, 7 years of 7, you have a year of Jubilee, which is you never really are able to sell land in the old nation of Israel. What you can do is you can sell it until the year of Jubilee. So the law says that you can sell it, and if there's 3 years left to the year of Jubilee, when everything is returned to its rightful owners and its rightful inheritance, then you sell it with a 3-year price. So it's kind of when you sell a piece of land in Israel, or when you become someone's indentured servant, everybody is set free. All the land is returned to its proper owners after the sabbatical year, after the year of Jubilee, which is after 7. It's the 7th year of 7 years of sabbatical. So the 50th year would be the year of Jubilee. So that's Leviticus 25. In Leviticus 26, we see the first blessing and or curse established concerning the Sabbath and other laws. In verse 34 of Leviticus chapter 26, you'll see that verse is the basis of the exile in Babylon. It basically says, if you violate the Sabbaths, then I'm going to send you into exile and give the land its rest, and it will recover while you're in exile. In verse 40, you'll see a promise to restore the nation once it's been humbled. That is the nation of Israel. That if they do these things, God says, if you do these things that I tell you, you'll have a long, happy life in the land that I give you. If you do not, what's going to happen is I will send you into exile, and I will give the land the rest that you would not. So after that, we now come to the nation of Israel. Before it was a nation without land. Now it is a nation with land. In the book of Joshua, which is written, Joshua's journey into the land of Israel begins about in 1406 BC. And in that book, it talks about the conquest of the land of Canaan. And approximately 1076 BC, the Sabbath years, for some reason, they just kind of quit observing them. They just kind of fall out of the back of their mind. Now, it's not coincidentally that around 1050 BC, Saul is anointed as the first king of Israel. And in 1 Samuel chapter 8, Samuel basically tells the people, he doesn't mention that the kings are going to quit giving the Sabbath year. But basically what happens is Samuel says, look, if you reject God and have to have a worldly king like the other nations, if you have to be like the other nations, then you are going to suffer from no rest. He's going to treat you like a slave. He's going to take your property. He's going to do all these things. Well, if we look back, that whole Sabbath year thing, if the king's taking your property, well, that's not in the law. There's nothing in the law that says it's okay for anyone to take your property and not have it and not give it back. So he tells him, he says, look, if you have a king, he's going to violate these laws. Basically, he's going to violate these Sabbath laws. And they say, we want a king anyway. So it's kind of funny that in 1050 BC, Saul becomes the first anointed king. And throughout the rest of the history of the kings of Israel, whether it's the United Kingdom or the divided kingdom, they never observe a Sabbath year again. They never observe a year of Jubilee. They never observe the seventh of the Sabbath. So, you'll find out when we get into Kings, 1 Kings chapter 12, that the nation divides. Basically what happens is King Solomon, who was King David's son, dies, and his son is a wicked man. Solomon taxed the people so that he could build the nation up as a military power and build the temple. His son says, I kind of like all this wealth. I kind of like taking your things for no reason. And I think I'll just keep taking them. And he says, if you think my father's taxes were heavy weight for mine. So the kingdom splits. And this happens about 930 BC.
And that king was who?
And that king was Rehoboam.
You said Solomon.
Yeah, Solomon's son.
Oh.
Rehoboam. Sorry if I've left that out or made a mistake there. So in 1 Kings chapter 12, the nation divides. We see the people that adhere to the Davidic covenant, a dynasty of kings. That's Judah, and they stay down in the southern kingdom. So they will remain. They will then be called the southern kingdom of Judah. And the other tribes, they go north, and they will be the northern, they will retain the name of Israel, but they will not have a king in David's lineage from then on. As a matter of fact, they will never again have a good king, period, ever. Every king that they ever have will be a wicked king. And because of this, they are first destroyed in 722 BC. So when we start talking about the nation of Israel, technically, the nation of Israel, the northern kingdom of Israel, was destroyed in 722 BC. And it was destroyed by the Assyrian Empire, who were really mean, evil, and wicked. But God kept telling them, look, he sent them prophets over and over and over again. You ever read about Ahab and Jezebel in the book of Kings? That's the northern kingdom. And so they're destroyed in 722 BC. Now, as far as the southern kingdom, it will live on for a while. They've got some good kings, they've got some bad kings, but overall, they live about 200 more years than the northern kingdom once they're brought into exile by the Assyrians. And Jeremiah will become a prophet to them. Of course, there are other prophets like Isaiah there, but for this line of thought, we're going to go with Jeremiah. In Jeremiah chapter 25, verses 11 and 29, verse 10, we're going to see that the prophet predicts, God gives the prophet a vision of 70 years of exile in Babylon. And he says, they're coming. It's going to happen. And I want you to remember this prophecy, because later on, these prophecies here in Jeremiah are going to be very key to what's going on here. So just if you print this off or want to make a note of this one, so just remember Jeremiah 25:11 and 29 and 10. Now, Jeremiah will tell them over and over and over again, you are violating the Sabbath. God has promised this. He has promised either a blessing or a curse upon the land, depending on your actions, how you relate to the Lord your God. They do not heed. So after about 490 years of not giving the land the Sabbath land, and it's not just that, it's also that you'll read in there that they didn't take care of the homeless or the widows or the orphans or the resident alien that lived in their land. They didn't basically do what Jesus said. They didn't love God or their neighbor. And so God sends them, prepares the exile for them. So we have 3 waves of deportation. And those 3 waves of deportation, if you want to read about those, they happen in 2 Kings chapters 24 and 25 and 2 Chronicles chapter 36. So in 605 BC, we have the first one, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, which was probably the richest, most opulent empire in the world at that point in time. He is fighting with the Egyptians. Now, the reason this concerns us in our story is that because of their disobedience, Israel or Judah, the southern nation of Judah, has already fallen to be a vassal state that's paying tribute to the Egyptians. And so when the Egyptians say, we're going to go to war with Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians, they really don't have any choice. The pharaohs say, come, I want you to send your armies into war. And they really don't have any choice. They're kind of a conquered people who are just allowed to live but pay really stringent taxes, and they're kind of under the thumb of the pharaoh at this point in time. So in 605 BC, at the Battle of Carchemish, the Egyptians, the Egyptians are defeated along with their Judean associates by Nebuchadnezzar. So part of his spoils of war is he comes to Jerusalem. He takes a lot of the king's family. He takes the best and the brightest of the land. Here's where we start to run into this. Guess who goes out in the first deportation? Daniel. Daniel is one of the best and the brightest. So Daniel now becomes not a direct object of God's wrath, but he's just kind of caught up in things that are going on. I mean, he's a good guy. He loves God. He's following after God, but because of just the wicked things that are happening around him, it's one of those things that bad things happen to good people. I mean, it is a fallen world, and it wasn't like God looked down and said, I want Daniel, I'm going to punish Daniel in this. But God says, in this bad situation where his people are punished, and Daniel's going to suffer this too. When you read the book of Daniel in the first chapter, it doesn't out and out say it, but it's pretty much implied that Daniel's made a eunuch, and his ability to have a family and descendants, which were one of the promises to the Jewish people, that's all taken away from him. But he continues to serve God. So he is taken away and deported in 605 BC. In 597, Judah, now a vassal state to Babylon instead of Egypt, rebels against the Babylonian king and suffers yet another deportation. This time, another name you may recognize, Ezekiel the prophet, is taken to Babylon. And from Babylon, he will give prophecies in Ezekiel 2 all the way through Ezekiel 24 on the destruction of Jerusalem, of the capital, basically the end. Because all of this, God comes to him and says, I've done all this stuff to chastise them. I've taken their best and brightest. I've came and I've taken you and I've taken their riches from them and given them into the hands of the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, who didn't really need it to begin with. He was already rich, but once you're rich, you always want more. And he says, okay, Ezekiel, I want you to tell them that that this is going to come. The ultimate destruction is going to come of the nation of Judah, and it's going to be desolate. So just a side note to this, one thing I find interesting, you may remember that Solomon's temple is still there. They've done a lot of bad things there. They've set up idols and all these things, but still you wonder why that God would allow his temple to be destroyed. Well, you see in Ezekiel chapter 10 that Ezekiel prophesies and has a vision of the Spirit of God leaving the temple. And it actually goes out and goes up above the Mount of Olives. So it's pretty cool. The Spirit of the Lord leaves the temple and goes up and off the Mount of Olives. And Jesus Christ, spends a lot of time up there and rises up into heaven off the Mount of Olives. It seems like a pretty prominent place for the Lord to leave Israel. So then we have our last and final destruction. Judah rebels again due to false prophets urging the king to rebel against Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon. And you'll see this in Jeremiah 6 and 14. And that siege leading up to the deportation will be so severe that the people will actually, inside the fortress of Jerusalem, will actually turn to cannibalism because Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians have starved them out for so long.
Gross.
Yeah, it is pretty gross. If you didn't hear, Becky says that's pretty gross, and it is. So the siege goes on so long that they begin eating themselves, especially even it says women eating their children and men eating their sons. And that's in Ezekiel chapter 5, verse 10, and that's prophesied. So after this, only the poor and most destitute are left in Israel. Everyone is hauled off. The final king of Israel is hauled off and brought out and slaughtered. And all of this happens. We get to the book of Daniel, and all of this happens because God promises the people, if you obey my laws, if you follow my statutes, if you do the things that I tell you to do, then I will multiply you in the land. If you do not, I will take rest for the land. So because they forsook for 490 years the Sabbath year, God sends them into 70 years of captivity. If you do the math there, every year that they left out the Sabbath year, God puts them into captivity to give the land rest. Now, obviously, the whole book of Daniel is not about violating the Sabbath. That's one of a multitude, but that is where God gets the length of the captivity in the book of Daniel. So I just thought that was important, and I wanted you to understand going forth that, like I said earlier, a lot of the things that pertain to the book of Daniel, they're not going to pertain necessarily to me and you. And the book of Daniel, one of the reasons I find it most fascinating is that we see there are places in the Bible where prophecy is still to come. If you're looking for signs for Jesus to come, you're not going to find it in the book of Daniel. You know why? There are no more signs that need to be fulfilled for Jesus Christ to come back. All of the apostles, Paul, Luke, Mark, all of those guys who wrote the New Testament books were very certain that Jesus Christ could come back at any point in time. Now, I've heard different people teach things out of context. I heard a preacher one time who's fairly famous around here. He came to a church to preach on prophecy. He read Matthew chapter 24 and proclaimed that as signs for the coming of Jesus Christ that must be accomplished. And then he got into all kinds of numerology and everything else. And I just left totally crushed because, number one, the Matthew chapter 24 of Matthew and the corresponding chapters in Luke and Mark are about the second coming. They're not about the rapture. They're not. They're about Jesus coming after the tribulation. They're not about the rapture at all. But this, they were taken out of context. So we need to take it into context. And we need to know exactly where it fits. And we need to know the audience, because if you look at Matthew chapter 24, Jesus is talking to a very Jewish audience about a very Jewish temple. That's the question they asked. When you look at the book of Daniel, and there are things about the Messiah. There are things that are going to happen in the future. But most of the things that happen in Daniel have already happened. And the reason I find the book of Daniel absolutely fascinating is because, especially, there's one chapter, unless you compare it to history, It's really, really confusing, and it talks about the kings of the north and the kings of the south and the queen of the north and the queen of the south, and it's all about the politics and the wars that are happening around Israel. It's about Syria and it's about Egypt. And we'll get into that later, and I'll share with you some resources on that where you can do some research on your own. I do ask you and think that it would be great, and the reason I gave you these notes is not just so that you could read along with me while I was speed reading through them, but it is because I want you to go back and I want you to read the Bible, and I want you to check this out for yourself. You may disagree with me. You may have a favorite commentator that thinks that it's totally different, and if so, that's fine. But like I said, one of the reasons I've studied Daniel pretty extensively is just because there's so much prophecy that's already been fulfilled in so much detail that it just fascinates me, that God is so detailed about the prophecies that he's given, and he's so exact. And so the parts, like when we will get into Daniel's 70 weeks, it gives me supreme confidence in the parts that are yet to be fulfilled, that they will be fulfilled, and they will be fulfilled accurately, and that God's plan is unstoppable no matter what happens in human history. So guys, I'm going to open it up to questions, and if you're watching this as a recording and you have questions, feel free to reach out to us. Our contact information is on our website. It is thepeaksareHis.com, or look to our Facebook page. You can private message us there, and we'd love to answer any questions or concerns that you have. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to